Hi and welcome back to a new video. In this video we are looking at resolvers. For what do you need them, why do you need them, and how you implement them, for example in a front-end like Angular. So in our case we are looking at Angular 18, so the latest version that is being released in 2024 so far. And as always we are going to start with some general information, so about resolvers, why you need them or why you might need them. And also at a user story, so what we are going to implement in this video. Then we will have a short look at the outcome of the code, so we look at the running project, and then we look at the implementation. So we are going through the code creation step by step, and I explain, I think, like every code that I write. So let's have a short look to the outcome of the video. So here we have our Angular front end, we have our nest.js backend that is giving us a request that is being delayed for 2 seconds. So as you see, as soon as I hit the route here again, we have a loading information for the user. And as soon as the request completes, we display here the user list. And this works by, as soon as our user here hits our route, then our resolver queries via service our backend, so nest.js. And then we are displaying the user this loading information here actually. And as soon as the request completes and we have the data, then the resolver stores this data in our activated route in Angular and redirects the user to the route. So that then in our component we have access to the activated route data and can use it synchronously and not asynchronously in our component. So let's have a look at the user story and at the concept of resolvers. So let's start maybe with the resolvers before. So they are primarily used to handle logic that should be executed before navigating to a route. They are being used in many frameworks, for example Angular, what we are implementing, but also in other, and you can also do it just by coding it yourself. So mostly they are about prefetching data from the backend before accessing a route. So what this means is, you can see it here, that as soon as the user is hitting a route, then the resolver is coming in and is doing all the stuff that we are telling him and is not letting the user through until all this is done. So for example, if the resolver is making a request to the backend via a service, for example, then it will only let the user access the route if all the data is loaded completely. So for example, here we would implement a loading spinner in Angular so that the user is getting some feedback from the UI, and only if all the data is there, the user gets redirected. So also you can do with this routing behavior, for example, load data depending on the rights of a user. It will also improve the user experience because like all the required data is already there if the user is on the route. And we can also use it to abstract logic between fetching the data and the component logic, for example in Angular. And when it's very good to use is in Angular, for example, if you need like a very stable state in your component, the resolver will always make sure that all the data you need, if you told him before, is available. Here we have our very short story. So as a developer, I want to have an example app to showcase how a resolver in Angular works. It should prefetch data from our backend before navigating to a route, and it should also display a loading spinner or a loading information. So we have some criteria here. So set up Angular, our Angular frontend and our nest.js backend should be started via one script actually. I don't think that we need this. We can just say it started separately. Then the Angular resolver should be executed before hitting a route and fetch data from the backend via its Angular service. And while we are getting some data from our backend, we want to display a loading spinner. Here you have also like a README how to run this project. So for example, to start our backend, you have to cd into our backend folder, then install all the dependencies and then start it. And then you can start also the Angular front end. So you have to navigate to the folder, install and run it. And here you have also some setup steps from our nest.js backend. So how to install the CLI, how to run or start the new project, what to do, and the same for Angular, and all other stuff you will see in the code or in the video. So let's start by going to our folder, or maybe first install the Angular CLI before. So for this we can just go to Google and Google npm Angular CLI, and then we have like the npm repository. So remember, you need to have installed Node.js and npm before, so we can just use this here. So we can say npm install, then we can call it -g, so we have it installed globally, and then we just go at angular/CLI, and then this will install like the Angular CLI for us globally, and then we are able to use it to, for example, create like a new app skeleton for us. So when this is done, we can then use it. So here we can now cd into our folder. So we can go to resolvers and then to 2024. And here now we want to create our Angular application. So as soon as this is finished, we can use this, and then we can go to our Angular documentation. So here, let's make it full screen. Go to the docs, installation, and here we see the npm install globally, the CLI, and then we can just use ng-new to create a new project. You see here now we are finished, so now we should be able to use here ng-new, and then we can name our projects Angular Resolvers Frontend 2024. And since we are in the 2024 folder, this will create us our Angular frontend. We can use SCSS. We don't want to use server-side rendering. And then we have here our Angular project. So you see it at the moment, it is not checked in Git. So this we can do at the end. And now we have here all our code generated. So we have our package JSON with all our dependencies, our start commands. It's now installing all the packages that we need. So at the moment it says they are missing, so it's installing all of them. And then we have our code in our source. So we have an index.html that is just the app root. So linking to our component here. So this is our app root. And we have our app config where Angular is like configured. So we have a change detection, we have our router at the beginning, and we have at the moment no routes. And so this is where we want to work. So right now we have to wait till everything is installed. So here we have now everything installed, and now we can just cd into our folder. So we can cd into our Angular frontend. And now we want to generate with the Angular schematics, so like ng, and then we can say generate. For example, we now need a user service, so we can say service with the name user, and then this will generate it for us. And the shortcut is generate, and then for example S for service. So we need, for example, a resolver, so we need a user resolver. We need a component. So we can use also the shortcut C for component and say also user. And the same goes for our interceptor. So this should be called loading interceptor. So we want to generate a loading interceptor skeleton. And then we can also start by making a little bit of a structure here. So we have here our user component. So we could, for example, move this into a directory called components, our component, and just drag it. And then we could also rename this to components. Then you see we have here our interceptor. So we could make another folder or directory called interceptors. Interceptors. And then drag it there. Then we have another like service and resolvers, so we can make another resolvers directory and a service one, so services. And we can move the resolver to here. And we can move the service to here. And now we can also make like a folder for our interfaces, for example, or our models. And then we can say here we also want to create like a file user.interface.ts. And now maybe it's a good way or a good point to look at our backend. So what we have there, so we have here our nest.js backend, and there we just have a user module with a user controller that gives us like all users under the route localhost 3000 API users. And we also have a delayed endpoint so that we can later test with this. So it will delay like the response for 2 seconds, so 2000 milliseconds. And so with this endpoint, we are later able to test like our loading spinner or our loading component, however we want to implement it, so that we are actually able to see it, because if the request returns like the response in a few milliseconds, you won't be able to see the spinner directly. So we have here our user entity that has just an ID and name. So in our interface, in our frontend, we can then make an interface for our user, and we can just say export interface user, and then we give him the ID and the name, and the ID is a number and the name is a string, so same as here, so that we are aligned to our backend entity. So probably the next thing could be to implement our service that we can actually make a backend request. So here you see we have our user service, and what we need here now is we need for once our endpoint. So we can say we have here our private users API, and this will just be a string, and this will be located under, let's say, localhost or HTTP localhost 3000/API/users. Actually we need this, and so just for you to see it, we can also here cd into our nest.js backend and run our backend so that you see how the response would look like or will look like. And here we can just say npm run start dev, and this will fire up our nest.js service. And then we should be able to use this URL here in our browser to, so as soon as it started, you see it now here, and we can just make a get request, and then you see we get in return our 3 users that are created in our backend, or they are. So let's have a short look again in the code. So just what we are doing here in the backend is the user is being created, or the users are being created as soon as the backend is starting, and then the controller is here with this endpoint, is just delivering them from the local database. So this is here what we want to fetch also with Angular. So we have here our endpoint, and to make this request we need the HTTP client from Angular to make an HTTP request, and we can just inject it into our service. So we can use the Angular HTTP client, and we inject from Angular core. Then we won't need the constructor here, and we can just say we make a get all users function, and this should return an observable for our user type from our interface, and this will be like an array. And now we can just say return this.http client. So we want to make a get request, then the response is our user array, and this request should go against our users API endpoint. So for this to work, or for Angular to work, we have to provide Angular the HTTP client. So we can do this in our Angular config. So let's go away from our nest.js backend, go to our app.config. Here we have our providers at the moment. So we have the router and the zone detection. And now we also need our HTTP client. So we can say provide HTTP client. Actually, we have to do this in this providers area. And with this, we also want to use we also want to provide interceptors. And here we can just give it our loading interceptor that we are implementing later completely. And then this should be all set up later so we can run it. So now we have our service. Maybe the next is, so we want to display this in our front end. So we have to call the service, and we want to do this in our case from the resolver. So the resolver will, so we have to connect the resolver later with our routes. So we have to implement it here. And then as soon as the user navigates to this route, the resolver fire will do some logic. In our case, it will call our user service, and this will call our backend. And then it will save like the data into our activated route from Angular, so that we are then able to use this data in our component. And then like the async stuff is done before accessing the route, and then we are able to handle it like synchronously in our component. So we have here our user resolver. We could, for example, also name it get all users resolver. And here we could just provide him at first the user service. So we say const user service, and we say inject our user service that we just created. And then we can just return the user service dot get all users. And there's like a specialty. So what is it saying here? Not assignable to type resolver function. Why not? So this is here like a boolean, but actually this should be like our user array, and then it should be all fine. And the resolver has like a good function, so like a resolver automatically subscribes and unsubscribes on observables. So that we don't have to handle this separately. So in our case, against our backend request against our nest.js service. So now we have to actually use this. So for this, we can go to our routes and add like a new entry here. So we can use the base path. We want as a component to have our user component that we created at the beginning with our ng generate command. And then we can tell them here we want to use resolve, and there we give them like configuration. So we want to say we have our users, and this shall be resolved by our get all user resolver. maybe we can add like here some comments to explain it. So the resolver is executed as soon as the user is navigating to our path. So in our case it is, so it's like here always executed. And the data that is returned by the resolver, that is returned by the resolver, is being stored in the activated route.data, and in this case here it is stored under users. So actually this here, this users, as the name that we are giving him here. So it could also, if we change this, could be another property. So whatever you name the property here. And so in our component then, so in our user component, we have then access to this data. So in our case, the users, by just calling the activated route data.users, or here users, and access it. So now to make it a bit clearer, so we have here our app component HTML. This is just the Angular boilerplate code, so we do not need this, to be honest. So we can just delete it. Then in Angular we have the router outlet that is being used, so it knows, so like the index.html is loading the app component, and in the app component we can use the router outlet, so that then into this router outlet the component gets rendered where we are in our route. So in our case the user component will be rendered to it. So now we can just do our stuff in our user component. So here we now just have to get like the data from our activated route. So since with our resolver we are storing the data in our activated route, we just have to access it here, so we can give him the activated route. So we inject the activated route from Angular router into our component, and then we can just give him our users, and this is the user array. Don't know why it's not importing it always directly, the user. And then we can say this.activatedRoute.snapshot.data, and then we can just access it by calling users. So exactly where we provided it here. And now we have at the moment here our users work, but what we want to display is like a list of users. So we can do this by using like the new Angular template syntax, so like this control flow. So we can say if, and we can say users.length. So if the users.length is larger than 0, then we want to display like a simple list. So we could just say, so we have a div, we have a heading, let's call it user list, and then we can make an unordered list, so UL, and then with multiple list elements. So in our case, you know, in our backend we have at the moment 3 users that are being created, so we can use the Angular for loop and just say user of our users array, and we can use the track function, and we provided our user ID. And then here we can use a simple list item, and we want to use the username being displayed. And what we can also do here is we can give him an else case. So for example, if we don't have any users being returned from the backend, we can just say, in this case, we just display, let's say, also an H3 with no users found. So then we have like our code, and here maybe we can make a comment saying using new template syntax, template control flow. So the add if and add else and add for, of course. So I think now we could already try to start our front end, and then we would hopefully see that everything here is working. And then in the next step, I would like to also implement like the loading interceptor so that we can also see that it's really like the resolver is firing, it is loading the data, and only if the data is, only if we have the data, then we are getting redirected to the route. So we can now just say npm run start for our Angular frontend, and you remember our backend is already running. So now our frontend is running on localhost 4200, and so we go to localhost 4200, and we see here Angular resolvers frontend, so this is our title. At the moment it's not loading, so let's see what is happening. So we have like a course error from our backend. So because it is not allowing, because our backend is running on localhost port 3000 and our frontend is running on 4200, so we have to enable course so that our backend also allows requests from other domains, for example the localhost 4200 from our Angular. So we can say app.enable course. So in production you would not do this because it should be coming from only from known origins. So here we can make a command enable course, allow requests from all or other origins, e.g. localhost 4200, our Angular app. And then let's see if we hit it again. So now you see here we have our user list. So in our network the request is being made here, and the response is like the 3 objects, and then we have it rendered in our front end. So like the last step now is to implement in our front end also the interceptor. So for this we probably need like also a user service, a loading service, so we can move this to our user service. And make like a loading service directory. And there we can just make our loading.service.ts. And so for our service, what we are needing is to always be able to like see if we are having an open request against our backend or if they are all finished or closed. So we can make a loading service. So we give him an add injectable for root. And then we can use here like subjects from AXJS. So we say we have a loading subject, and this is a behavior subject. So this will always, if you subscribe to it, or if you change it, it will emit like the value. So and the initial value here is always false. And then we can make this subject also be converted to an observable. And this can just be our loading subject dot as observable. And this is then what we are subscribing, and this will only be changed from our in our class. So here we have a show loading function that is just setting our next value for our subject to true. So if we are loading or making a request to our backend, we set it to true, and then we emit this via this here to all components or services that are subscribing to this loading observable. And then we can also say hide loading or end loading, whatever you like to name it, and this is then setting it back to the value false, so that then the loading is being ended. And this is what we are now what we now can use in our interceptor. So you remember we have here our loading interceptor. That is an HTTP interceptor function. And first we have to inject our loading service so that we can work with it. Inject. So now we have the loading service. Then we need to know if we are loading at the moment or not. So when we are coming into this interceptor, so this interceptor will intercept all requests that we are sending out. So an interceptor will intercept all HTTP requests. So also our /API /users request or /API users delayed request. And now we can say we only want to display like the loading time or the loading indicator only if a request takes longer than 500 milliseconds. So we can say delay showing the loading spinner by 500 milliseconds. And this is also nestjs, and here we can now pipe it. So after the 500 milliseconds, we can say tap, and then we can set our values. So we can say the show loading is now true. So if our request to our backend took more than 500 milliseconds, we are now showing it, and we can set our loading service to show loading. And then afterwards we can use our merge map probably. To say next to request that we then can also pipe, and in the pipe we can do like a finalize, and then hide the loading, but only if the show loading is true. So we could also make it here and just use a simple if statement. So if the show loading here before is set to true, then we want to now hide the loading. And of course this here has to be deleted because it's never been reached. And now we have to connect the value. So we are now always setting the value in our loading service here for all HTTP requests that we are intercepting. So if they are taking longer than 500 milliseconds, then we would set the show loading to true. And as soon as the request completes, we are then hiding the loading. Or if the request is faster than 500 milliseconds, we will never show it actually. So this here is now not being used, but it's always been updated since we are calling show loading or hide loading that are setting here the next value, and this is then being converted here to an observable. So now we actually want to use it, and for this we can go to our app component, and we can say we have here our loading service. So I am now making it public because then I can also access it from my HTML template here. I could also make it private and then use another value for this, but I think we can just make a shortcut here. And you remember here we have our router outlet that is going then because we have our user component as path here with empty, so it's always displaying this here in our router outlet. And for our add if, we can now check our loading service if there is a value. So why is it not? Let's look it up. So this is public, so we should be able to access it here. And then there's the async pipe that we can use that is actually automatically subscribing and unsubscribing to the values. And so here we are saying if this value here is resolving to true. So if we are in the loading state, then we can just say we want to display like a div. I don't know, let's make it in H2 and say loading. And if the loading service.loading value is false, we can just say add else again and say then we want to display our router outlet. And now we can go to our front end here, that's still running. And we still see our user list. And now, as you remember, we have another endpoint in the back end that is being called /delayed. That takes like two seconds to resolve. So we can use here the delayed endpoint now, and we save it. We go back to our front end and we reload it again. Then we should hopefully, you see here loading, and then it should update as soon as the information is here. So you can see it also here for our requests. Let's see our delayed one. You see it here. And you can see it took like 2 seconds because in our backend it's delayed. And then after 500 milliseconds, so if we reload it, we again have the loading. And then as soon as the request completes and we have the data, then the spinning loading spinner gets away and we are being redirected to our users component or our route here. So now let's commit everything. And then later I will also add like some README files also. So the thing is, at the moment we are here still on the main branch, and we want to add everything that we just did. So here we can add all the changes and all the files that were not added so far, so from our front end, our back end, and so on. And then we can give it like a commit message, create Angular front end code for resolver and interceptor. Or let's say just create Angular front end code, and then we can push this.